14 German fighters closing fast, a formation of bombers, bleeding fuel and fire, and one pilot who ignored every rule in the manual, telling his crew to hold tight. He was going to do something no one in the European sky had ever tried. They thought he was insane. 5 minutes later, they were alive, and the Luftwaffe had a new nightmare to report. The winter of 1943 was a season of iron and despair, a cold so profound it carved deep into the bones of every airman stationed across the damp, wind-scoured airfields of eastern England. It was a cold that transcended temperature. It was the chill of statistical inevitability, of letters waiting to be written, of empty bunks in Nissen huts. Ice feathered on the inside of cockpit glass. Breath fogged and froze on oxygen masks, forcing men to claw at their faces to clear a view. Below, the familiar patchwork quilt of Britain's countryside, the hedgerows and stone walls, the villages and meandering rivers, disappeared for days at a time beneath a shroud of impenetrable December fog. And above, when the missions went, the contrails of 1,000 bombers scratched fragile, ephemeral white lines into the gray, leaden ceiling of war. They were like the chalk marks of a cosmic accountant, tallying up a terrible, ongoing sum. This was the brutal, costly height of the combined bomber offensive, the Allied attempt to strangle the Nazi war machine from the air. For the Americans of the 8th Air Force, this campaign was built on a doctrine of unwavering, almost theological faith, daylight precision bombing. It was a belief system rooted in a particular strain of American optimism and technological confidence. The cornerstone of this faith was the Norden bomb sight, a gyroscopically stabilized analog computer hailed as a marvel of engineering. The promise was that a skilled bombardier, peering through its optics from 20,000 feet, could, in the popular phrase, drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. In theory, this rendered the cover of night unnecessary. In theory, waves of rugged, heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly in tight, mutually protective box formations, sweep across occupied Europe in disciplined, unstoppable streams, surgically dismantling ball-bearing plants, fuel refineries, and aircraft factories, and return home under the protective umbrella of their own massed 50-caliber firepower. It was a clean, mechanical, and morally unambiguous vision of aerial warfare. In practice, over the grim turning point of 1943, it was slaughter. The theory collided with a hard, cruel reality named the Luftwaffe. German fighter commanders, brilliant tacticians like Adolf Galland, had studied the American formations and devised a form of interceptive violence that was as psychologically terrifying as it was physically destructive. The backbone of their defense became the Verbandsnachschut, the formation attack, but its most devastating expression was the frontal assault, the Sturmbach tactic. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and, more formidably, the heavier, harder-hitting Focke-Wulf FW-190s would use their superior climb rates to ascend high above the bomber streams, often positioning themselves with the sun at their backs to blind gunners. Then, in pairs or flights of 4, they would roll inverted and dive, not from the flank, but from dead ahead, aiming their entire aircraft and the concentrated fire of their wing-root cannons and machine guns like a lance at the heart of the formation. The physics were terrifying. A bomber cruising at 180 miles per hour and a fighter diving at over 400 miles per hour created a closing speed approaching 600 miles per hour. In that fleeting 5 to 10 second window, a German pilot had only to hold his course, fire a brief, devastating burst, and pull up or slide past. For the bomber crews, it was a nightmare scenario.
The B-17's vaunted firepower had a fatal flaw, a relative blind spot directly forward. The chin turret, introduced later, was not yet universal, and the nose guns, often manned by the bombardier, offered a limited field of fire. Gunners in the top, ball, and waist turrets had mere seconds to track, lead, and fire at a target that appeared as a distant speck, swelled to a screaming, cannon-flashing monster in an instant, and then vanished behind them. The sound alone was a weapon, the sudden, tearing canvas rip of 20-millimeter cannon shells walking through aluminum skin, the deeper thud of them striking engines or fuel tanks, the cacophony of shrapnel, the shriek of shearing metal. Most B-17s went down without their gunners ever landing a telling hit on these head-on attackers. The gunners knew it. The pilots, feeling the aircraft shudder under impacts they couldn't even see coming, knew it. And the Germans, returning to reform for another pass, knew it. The head-on attack was more than a tactic. It was a statement of dominance, a demonstration that the American doctrine was fundamentally vulnerable. By the winter of 1943, loss rates on deep penetration missions routinely exceeded 10%, and on some of the worst days, the second Schweinfurt raid in October saw 60 bombers shot down out of 291. They approached 25%. Entire squadrons, their ground crews waiting in vain, were erased from the roster over the Ruhr Valley or the ball bearing works at Berlin. Men flew their required 25 missions in a state of grim, fatalistic endurance. They counted missions like prisoners marked days on a wall, knowing that the law of averages was a predator slowly circling their formation. Superstition flourished. Lucky rabbit's feet, unwashed flight jackets, specific pre-flight rituals, all were clung to as talismans against the indifferent mathematics of flak and fighters. Into this unforgiving environment were thrown thousands of young men who months before had never seen a gun fired in anger. They were farm boys from Iowa and Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, Charlie Boy dropouts and factory workers, volunteers and draftees alike. The war demanded they trade solid earth for a cold, vibrating aluminum tube, to trust in engineering and each other as they flew into literal storms of steel. They learned the meticulous craft of high-altitude flight, formation discipline so tight that wingtips seemed to overlap, oxygen management at 25,000 feet where the air was too thin to think, the strange choreography of using heated suits and bulky gloves while trying to aim a machine gun at a darting speck. They learned to fear the telltale "bandits at 12 o'clock high" call over the radio. But no manual, no training film, no veteran's briefing could truly teach them how to survive that visceral terror of that head-on pass. There was no procedure for that moment. There was only acceptance, luck, and the desperate hope that the hail of lead would find some other ship, some other crew. The 8th Air Force Command was not blind to the carnage. They experimented relentlessly, tightening the box formations, staggering altitudes, developing elaborate assembly procedures. But the core problem remained. The bombers were alone for most of their journey. The early escort fighters, the rugged P-47 Thunderbolts and twin-boomed P-38 Liberators, were superb aircraft, but they were shackled by the crude physics of fuel consumption. Even with external drop tanks, their range in late 1943 barely stretched to the German border. At the jump-off point, these little friends would wag their wings and turn back, leaving the bombers to fly on into the heart of the Reich, naked and watched, while the Luftwaffe, with its interior lines and early warning radar, waited and gathered its strength. The sensory reality of a bomber mission was a world in itself, a deafening, frozen hellscape. It began with the deep rhythmic roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines at cruise power, a vibration that traveled up through the fuselage into the crew's bones. Then came the lesser sounds, the electric whine and hydraulic sigh of gun turrets swiveling on their ball bearings, the static crackle of interphone and radio chatter as pilots and gunners called out positions. Fighters 3 o'clock level, flak at 2 o'clock dense and accurate. Then the attack, the high-pitched scream of diving fighters, a sound that cut through even the engine noise, the distinct hammering burr-burr of German 20mm cannons, each explosive shell capable of tearing a man apart or severing a control cable, the slower, deeper thud of 50 caliber return fire from the bombers, and then the other sounds, the wet, sickening thump of rounds hitting flesh inside the aircraft, the shriek of torn metal, the sudden, terrifying silence when an engine, its oil lines severed, would cough and die, and the awful groaning protest of a wing spar failing, followed by the final, unstoppable spin to the earth, 6 miles below.
It was into this specific daily crucible that First Lieutenant James Howell Howard flew on January 11, 1944. For Howard, it was his 23rd mission with the 8th, but in truth, he was a veteran among rookies. At 30 years old, he was a senior figure in a squadron where many pilots were barely 22. He did not look the part of the swashbuckling, hell-raising fighter ace of popular imagination. He was of average height and build, with a calm, watchful demeanor. He was a thinker, an analyzer, a man of quiet discipline more than fiery pronouncements. His unusual background had forged in him a unique temperament. Born in Canton, China in 1913 to medical missionary parents, Howard's childhood was one of juxtapositions, immersed in the ancient complexities of Chinese culture, yet grounded in the pragmatic Protestant work ethic of his parents. His father ran a hospital, his mother taught school. Young James grew up in an environment where crises were routine, resources were always scarce, and solutions had to be improvised from first principles. There was no higher authority to call for backup. You assessed, you adapted, you acted. This upbringing instilled in him a profound sense of self-reliance and a cognitive habit of systems thinking, of seeing problems as interconnected puzzles to be solved, not merely obstacles to be endured. Returning to the United States for college, he enrolled at Pomona College in California with pre-med ambitions, but the sky called to him more powerfully than the dissection lab. In 1937, with war clouds gathering in both Europe and Asia, he left school and joined the U.S. Air Forces as an aviation cadet. Fate, in the form of a minor medical disqualification, grounded him. For most, that would have been the end of an aviation dream. For Howard, it was a detour. He went back to the world he knew, China. In 1941, he joined the American Volunteer Group, the legendary Flying Tigers, under the formidable Claire Chennault. The AVG experience was foundational. Flying the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk against the more nimble Japanese Zero over Burma and southern China, Howard and his comrades were the definition of an underdog force. They were outnumbered, outgunned, supplied by a trickle of resources over the Himalayas, and fighting with no promise of relief. Chennault, a brilliant tactical thinker, drilled into them a set of unorthodox, survival-based rules. Never turn with a Zero. Use the P-40's superior dive speed and ruggedness in hit-and-run slashing attacks. Fight as a team, using the sun and clouds for ambush. Always have an escape plan. Here, Howard learned that air combat was not about gallantry. It was about applied physics, psychology, and geometry. He learned to think 3 moves ahead of his opponent, to see the sky as a 3-dimensional chessboard. In 6 months of intense combat, he was credited with 6 aerial victories, proving himself one of the AVG's steadiest and most effective pilots. When the AVG disbanded in mid-1942, Howard, now a seasoned combat pilot, returned to the U.S. Air Forces and was commissioned into the 8th Air Force. Expecting a transfer to the Pacific, he was instead assigned to the very heart of the air war in England, the 8th Air Force.
By late 1943, he was flying with the 354th Fighter Squadron, part of the 355th Fighter Group. Their mount was the new, exquisite North American P-51B Mustang. With its elegant laminar flow wings and, most importantly, its game-changing British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang had the range to go all the way to Berlin and back. But in the winter of '43, Mustangs were still scarce, and the learning curve for long-range escort doctrine was steep. The bloodletting continued unabated. Howard stood apart in his new squadron. He wasn't one for the raucous parties in the officers' club, the heavy drinking that was many men's release from tension. He was studious. He pored over after-action reports, debriefed returning bomber crews, and quizzed other pilots about enemy tactics. He thought in terms of systems and patterns. How did the German controllers vector their fighters? What were the favored assembly points for Stormbach attacks? Where were the blind spots, not just in the bombers' defenses, but in the German intercept system itself? His squadron mates respected his quiet competence and his proven combat record from China, but some found his analytical, reserved nature inscrutable. His courage wasn't flamboyant, it was a settled, calculated fact. He flew like a man solving a complex equation in real time, his movements precise, economic, and devoid of panic. January 11, 1944 was a maximum effort mission. The target was a complex of German aircraft component factories around Ascherlissen, deep in central Germany. For the escorting Mustangs of the 354th, it was a stretch mission, pushing the very limits of their range. The calculus was brutal. They would have just enough fuel to rendezvous with the bombers near the target, stay with them through the most dangerous period of the bomb run and initial exit, and then race for home, engines leaned out to maximum economy, hoping to coast back over the English Channel on fumes. There was no margin for error, no time for extended dogfights. The mission began to unravel from the start. Over the North Sea, thick cloud cover scattered the elaborate bomber formations. The stream became ragged, losing the dense protective concentration of fire the box formation provided. Radio channels clogged with urgent calls as flights tried to reassemble. This was exactly the scenario the Luftwaffe hoped for. Stragglers and isolated groups were easy prey. Howard's flight of 4 Mustangs made their rendezvous, but chaos reigned. German fighters, mostly aggressive FW-190s, appeared in strength, not in neat lines for a single pass, but in aggressive, swirling packs. The escort doctrine of the day was to engage the enemy fighters away from the bombers, to break up their attacks before they could be launched. It was a fighter pilot's instinct: see the enemy, chase the enemy. Howard's flight was soon sucked into a swirling, fuel-burning dogfight. Pilots broke formation to pursue targets or defend themselves. In the confusion, Howard found himself alone. He had fired his guns, turned hard, strained to keep sight of both friend and foe, and then he looked east. What he saw was an escort commander's nightmare. A formation of about 30 B-17s, likely from the 401st Bomb Group, had become separated from the main stream. They were limping along, some trailing smoke, visibly vulnerable. And below them, climbing with lethal, patient grace in a wide spiral, was a swarm of at least 12 German fighters, a mix of FW-190s and Bf-109s. They were positioning themselves for the perfect head-on strike. It was a predator circling wounded prey. Howard's mental dashboard lit up. Fuel critically low, already into the reserve for the return leg. Ammunition partially expended. Position deep inside Germany, alone. Allies, a quick scan of the empty contrail-streaked sky revealed no other P-51s. The bomber's own gunners were his only possible support. He tried his radio. Static. He was cut off, a single slender blue aircraft against a vast hostile sky. Every rule, every shred of doctrine, every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to disengage. He had done his job. He had engaged the enemy. To stay now was to risk not just being shot down, but running out of fuel over the North Sea. The rational choice was to turn west and try to link up with the bomber stream for the mutual protection of the journey home. The bombers below were, by the cold calculus of war, already written off. But Howard's calculus was different. He didn't see a lost cause, he saw a problem. The problem was a dozen fighters about to murder 30 bombers. The solution, however unorthodox, had to involve stopping those fighters. He did not see himself as a knight on a charger, but as a variable that could be inserted into the equation to change its outcome. With a calm that was neither fearless nor reckless, but simply decisive, he shoved the throttle of his P-51 to the firewall and dove toward the fight. The German fighters, focused on their meticulous setup, did not immediately react to the lone Mustang streaking down from above. Howard seized that millisecond of surprise. He didn't go for a shooting pass on the climbing Germans. Instead, he positioned himself between them and the bombers. He rolled out of his dive just ahead and slightly below the lead B-17s, throttling back to match their slower speed. He was now flying in the same direction as the bombers, a tiny, agile escort ship nestled perilously close to their vast, lumbering forms.
To the bomber crews, this was bizarre, even alarming. A fighter flying inside the formation was unprecedented. Some gunners, nerves frayed to breaking point, instinctively tracked him with their .50 caliber sights. Was he a damaged German trying a ruse? A lost, disoriented Allied pilot? Over the interphone, confused calls echoed. Fighter in the formation. Blue 1 at 12 o'clock low. Hold fire. I think he's friendly. Then the first German flight attacked. 2 FW-190s peeled off from the climbing pack and dove, noses glowing with the light of their cannons. The classic head-on pass. The bomber pilots, locked into formation discipline, could only fly straight and take it. The closing speed was horrific. But Howard, positioned directly in their path, didn't evade. He waited, a stationary guardian in a moving frame. At the last possible second, he fired a sharp, accurate burst directly at the lead Focke-Wulf and then broke sharply left. He hadn't aimed to hit necessarily, but to deny. The German pilot, faced with the sudden, unexpected sight of an enemy fighter firing head-on at him from within the bomber pack, instinctively flinched. He pulled up, his attack ruined. His wingman followed. The pass was broken. This was Howard's revelation, the tactical innovation born of necessity and analysis. The head-on attack's entire lethality depended on an unobstructed high-speed run at a predictable target. By placing himself in that fatal funnel, he had transformed the physics of the engagement. Now, a German pilot had to worry about colliding not just with a bomber, but with a nimble, armed fighter. The risk-reward ratio shifted instantly. Howard was no longer just shooting at them, he was obstructing them. The Luftwaffe pilots, skilled and determined, were not deterred. They regrouped and tried different angles, beam attacks from the side, diving attacks from above and behind. Howard became a whirling, pivoting dynamo. He would dart from one threatened sector of the bomber formation to another, firing short, disciplined bursts to break up attacks, then sliding back to his central blocking position. He wasn't trying to dogfight. He was outnumbered far too badly for that. He was playing a game of high-speed, three-dimensional chess, using his presence as the queen on the board, controlling key squares. He exploited the Mustang's superb roll rate and acceleration to be everywhere he was needed, just in time. A remarkable unspoken communication developed between the lone fighter and the 30 bomber crews. The gunners stopped seeing him as an anomaly and began to see him as their key defender. They held their fire when he crossed their fields of vision. Tail gunners called out threats approaching from the rear for him. Ball turret gunners with a unique view downward reported on fighters climbing from below. It was an improvised organic air defense network centered on one man. For nearly 30 minutes, this surreal battle raged. Howard's ammunition counters ticked down toward zero. His fuel gauge needle sank inexorably toward the empty pin. His cockpit was a cacophony of warning signs, the engine running hot, the smell of cordite and oil seeping in, the adrenaline-sharpened focus that made time seem both stretched and instantaneous. He took hits. The thwack of armor-piercing rounds striking his airframe was a constant percussion. One shell shattered his canopy plexiglass just behind his head, filling the cockpit with a blast of freezing oxygen-thin air. Another damaged his coolant system, sending a thin white streamer trailing behind him, a telltale sign of a dying engine that the Germans would normally pounce on. But Howard's aggressive, disruptive tactics kept them off balance. He never let them settle into a coordinated, overwhelming attack. Slowly, the German attacks lost their cohesion. Frustrated, low on fuel and ammunition themselves, and perhaps unnerved by the tenacious, seemingly suicidal defense of this one pilot, they began to break off. The bombers, miraculously, were still holding formation. Not one had been shot down during Howard's lone vigil. As the last FW-190s turned away, diving for their own bases, Howard faced his final crisis. He was now alone over Germany with a damaged plane and virtually no fuel. He eased his battered Mustang out of the bomber formation. The lead B-17, its pilot understanding what had just transpired, waggled its wings, the universal aerial salute. Howard, too exhausted for radio calls, returned the gesture with a slow dip of his own wings. Then he turned his nose toward the distant west and began the long, silent glide. He shut down his damaged engine to conserve what little coolant remained and to prevent a catastrophic seize. The P-51 became a silent glider. He traded altitude for distance, nursing every foot of height into forward motion. The North German plain slid by beneath him, then the coastline. The cold, gray expanse of the North Sea appeared. He was far too low, far from any friendly airfield. Miraculously, his sputtering Merlin held on long enough for him to sight the English coast. He crossed the white cliffs at barely 500 feet. Ahead, he saw a Royal Air Force emergency field. With no power for a second approach, he lined up perfectly. His wheels touched down, and as the P-51 rolled to a stop on the unfamiliar turf, the engine gave one final cough and died utterly. Ground crews rushed out to find a Mustang that looked like a colander. Over 20 bullet and cannon holes peppered its wings, fuselage, and tail. The coolant system was empty, the fuel tanks were dry, and the cockpit was a shambles of broken glass and spent shell casings. Climbing out stiffly, Howard filed a terse, unembellished combat report. He noted engaging enemy aircraft in defense of bombers, mentioned probable damage to several, and stated he had run low on fuel and made an emergency landing. He claimed no confirmed kills. He spoke in the flat, technical language of the professional soldier. It was the bomber crews who, returning to their bases, unleashed the story. Their debriefings were electric with a kind of awed disbelief. Gunners and pilots alike described the lone blue Mustang that had fought off a small army for half an hour. Their estimates of enemy aircraft engaged ranged from 14 as high as 30. The intelligence officers, cross-referencing these emotional, consistent accounts with Howard's dry report, realized something extraordinary had happened. The story rocketed up the chain of command. Within days, it reached the desk of 8th Air Force Commander Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle. Here was not just an act of valor, but a potential tactical revelation. Howard had violated protocol, yes. He had risked everything in a way that could not be ordered or institutionalized. But he won. In a war where bomber losses were threatening the viability of the entire daylight campaign, results trumped orthodoxy. Howard had demonstrated in the starkest terms possible that the passive, perimeter-based escort doctrine was insufficient against the head-on attack. The most effective defense was an active, intimate one. The escort had to get in the way. On June 5, 1944, James Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation read, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, First Lieutenant Howard voluntarily flew his heavily armed single-engine fighter as escort for a formation of B-17 heavy bombers. When the bomber formation was attacked by more than 30 enemy fighters, he engaged the enemy and, in the ensuing fight, alone and unassisted, so effectively disrupted the enemy's attack that it was broken up before it could be pressed home. His skill, courage, and unwavering devotion to duty are in the keeping with the highest traditions of the military service. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the nation's highest award.
But the medal was merely the symbol. The real impact was doctrinal. His desperate, improvised stand became a celebrated case study. While no commander would ever order a pilot to duplicate his lone wolf defense, it was far too risky. The core principle was absorbed and adapted. Fighter groups began to emphasize close escort and target support missions with a new vigor. Pilots were encouraged to stay tighter to the bombers, to position themselves proactively along the anticipated attack axes, especially the deadly 12 o'clock. The mere presence of a fighter in that critical forward arc, as Howard had shown, forced German pilots to hesitate, divert, or abort their runs. It injected uncertainty into their previously clockwork tactics. This shift coincided and was amplified by the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang in overwhelming numbers. Now the escorts could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The combination of superior numbers, superior range, and a more aggressive, intimate escort philosophy began to turn the tide in the spring of 1944. The Luftwaffe was bled white, not just in the air, but on the ground, as Allied fighters roamed freely hunting aircraft on their runways. Loss rates for the bombers began a steady, welcome decline. The head-on attack, while never completely abandoned, lost its aura of invincibility. The Big Week offensive of February 1944, which targeted the German aircraft industry, was a brutal but decisive campaign where the new escort tactics proved their worth. Howard himself flew more missions, eventually becoming a squadron commander. He finished the war credited with a total of 12.25 aerial victories, combining his AVG and 8th Air Force scores. But his legacy was never about the number. He survived the war, stayed in the newly formed United States Air Force, and retired as a brigadier general in 1966. He lived a quiet, private life, a man who had done his duty and asked for no fanfare. When pressed about January 11th, he would deflect praise. "I seen my duty and I'd done it," he'd say in his plain-spoken way. Or, more revealingly, "It was a problem of geometry. I was in a position to solve it." His true legacy lives on in the fundamental principles of air combat. He proved